Hello, you sentient ball of stardust. My name is Casey Davis. I'm a therapist and I'm an author of the book How to Keep House While Drowning, where I talk about ways to make it a little bit easier to take care of yourself when you're overwhelmed, stressed, have mental health issues, physical health issues, or maybe you're just in a hard season of life. Maybe you're looking for a place that you can come and listen to some practical advice. This is a podcast for all of the self-help rejects. We're going to talk about skills for survival and self-kindness. And I'm going to leave the pop psychology at the door. I promise not to tell you to meditate or to journal. We're just going to give you some really insightful conversations with hopefully some practical advice. So I don't believe you need to pick yourself up by the bootstraps. I don't want you to just try harder, and I don't believe that laziness exists. So join me over on Struggle Care, where we can find compassionate solutions that help us function a little bit better.
You probably know the feeling. Sweaty, fast breathing, quick heart rate. That's a cortisol spike. It feels awful, and its imbalance is the cause of your anxiety. Rebalance Health's 3-part anxiety system helps address it at the root. Rebalance Health lozenges are natural and designed for optimal absorption, providing 24-hour relief. Live life fully without feeling like you're fighting for it. Get 50% off your first month with code CALM23 at rebalancehealth.com.
Stoveleg Media, igniting conversation.
Hey guys, how's it going? It's me, your host, Elena Grace, and you're listening to another episode of I've Been Thinking. Alright, so y'all, this is a book of the month that I have wrestled with a little bit. I have very much gone back and forth on her, trying to decide if I had the energy to put towards this, trying to decide if this is what I wanted to do, trying to decide if I should even do a book of the month this month, right? But I have decided, and honestly, God and the universe kind of decided this for me, that it must be done. And there's literally no better week to do this. So, welcome to our November 2020 election week book of the month episode. We are going to be discussing William Stringfellow's Dissenter in a Great Society, an indictment of Christian complacency in American life. Now, I actually found this book on my dad's bookshelves in his office when I was home for a little bit over the summer, cleaning out some stuff, and it made me chuckle. My father would be very easy to throw into a stereotypical mold if you just looked at him. He's bald, he's fit, he's probably wearing some shade of desert tan. If he's dressed up, he always has his 100th Division lapel pin proudly displayed. He is a soldier through and through, but he is also a scholar, and he always has been. So when I found this, it was very fitting, I guess, that I stumbled across this, because he and I had been having some disagreements, and perhaps I had been making some assumptions about him and putting him into stereotypes. And perhaps he had been doing the same about me. And finding this book reminded me of who he really is. So, the book. Let me start, okay, by reading you one of the comments on the back of the book. Remember back in the day when they would put like the summary on the back of the book, but they would also have like one or two little reviews instead of the whole back of the book being covered in reviews that don't tell you anything about whether or not you want to read it. Yeah, so this is the comment the review that's on the back of the book. It says, recommended to every intelligent reader who may have begun to suspect that morality has given way to expediency, truth to propaganda, and idealism to self-aggrandizement in our, quote, great society. Damn. How much more timely can you get? All right, so I gave the book a quick once-over, right? And I gleaned a handful of things from this book. Truly, it goes so much deeper than what I'm going to give you guys today. This is just a very, high view highlight of my biggest takeaways from each chapter of the book, right? So it's split into 4 chapters, and they build on one another, right? But I'm going to, of course, go ahead and start with chapter 1. This chapter is entitled Poverty, Property, and People. So Stringfellow, the author, begins very strongly. He says that poverty in the United States is a moral shortcoming of its affluent, and that it is evidence of greed, of apathy, and of a lack of individual maturity. That is because the United States has every resource, every possible reason for everybody in the United States to at least be living comfortably. We're not India, where there's not an economic structure that's strong enough for it. We are not some tiny third world country where there's not infrastructure, where there's just not resources. We are none of those places. We have the resources. We have the infrastructure. We have every reason for everybody to at least have their basic human rights met, their basic human needs. And yet we don't. And so Stringfellow says that is an individual issue, that is a moral shortcoming of our affluent, the people in charge, right? And by association, I suppose, the people who vote for them and who put them in those positions ultimately. So really interestingly, this book was written during the infancy of the War on Poverty, a movement that I know as a hereditary Appalachian put systems in place that in the long term would further cripple an underserved people. The inequities of education and employment were never solved, and in fact have been further exacerbated as time passed, and it became more profitable to move jobs overseas, right? And the author, Stringfellow, he accurately supposes that the meager funds designated to the project would not address the root causes, because it didn't. It only addressed the symptoms, and it put Band-Aids on wounds that hadn't even been cleaned, So because of this, it didn't create any kind of long-time change. It just created remedial changes that would open no exits from the poverty. And to continue, all of this kind of comes from, he says, the idolatry of money. Embracing money as a sign of rationality and of moral significance, which is probably one of the biggest mistakes that we've ever made as a nation or as a religion, as a Christian. The worth of a man being judged in terms of the amount of money he is in possession or control of. I mean, what? It has come to, and if you think about it, we see this so often, a person's virtue essentially correlates to his acquisition of money, right? Or her, obviously. Don't come for me. it's very important to note that Stringfellow says that this is, quote, empirically absurd because it so oversimplifies the relationship between the wealthy and the poor, especially as the wealthy depend upon the poor for their wealth. So the affluence of the few is related to and supported by the poverty of the many, right? And I mean, it's crazy to think that we have gotten to this point where we think that there is truly some moral, ethical, hell, superstitious reason why somebody with more is better. It's crazy because if we think about it in the Bible, right, just as an example, tax collectors were some of the wealthiest people in the Bible, and they were the most demonized. Tax collectors were as looked down upon as, I don't know, as a leper maybe. I mean, it's spoken of when you learn about it as he was a tax collector. That means he was rich. That means he made good business choices, right? No, that means he was a bad guy. So why, at what point did we stop demonizing people who made their money on oppressing others, monetarily or otherwise? I don't know. I don't get it. Okay, so each chapter ends with a verse. So, or begins actually rather, with a verse. So I'm going to read to you the Bible verse that begin this chapter. It's from 2 Corinthians 8:13 through 14. It says, I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but that as a matter of equality, your abundance at the present time should supply their want, so that their abundance may supply your want, that there may be equality. Something to think on, Okay, chapter 2, the political crisis. In this chapter, Stringfellow talks about how political ideologies are often acquired not out of actual ideological consideration, but by what our parents or our families have taught us to believe and to vote for, and what local circumstances dictate. And by that, he doesn't typically mean like, oh, my region needs this, so I'm going to vote for this person because their ideology, matches that, or because their platform matches that. But it's everybody else around here is a Republican, so that must be the best thing, right? So he goes on to say that the confrontations between people with opposing views are, quote, marred by distortion, defamation, and hysterics, which, honestly, preach. So many people today are so unaware of the policies even of a candidate, and even further, so many people are purposefully ignorant of the transgressions of the candidates against other human beings, but also against the people as a whole, as they're acting from the post that we elected them to. And then we just allow this to continue over and over. We choose to allow ourselves to be pushed and pulled by the media, by one another, all of these things. When will that end, Anyway, Stringfellow continues on to say that the entrapment of the poor, and in particular, but not only, the racial minorities, allows for the continued affluence of the few. And he argues that this is perhaps one of the most perverse weaponizations of Christianity in politics, that that so many pastors and pulpits continue to echo the idolatry of money and the idea that God rewards us monetarily when we are righteous and takes away from those who are not. Now, I don't know about you, but that's not the Jesus I learned about. The Jesus that I know, that is in my heart, washed the feet of the poor and the ill. And I don't know what he would think about that. I always think about, actually, that reminds me of some family members of ours, of my family's, that they would give exceptionally to the church, which on the surface is wonderful, but in reality, they gave because they believed that by giving exceptionally, they would be rewarded, 3, 4, 5 times that much. And that's not why you should give. That's not why you should do anything. You shouldn't act with an expectation of reciprocity. You should give even if it's your last penny and you don't know where you're going to eat. That if you're truly, worried about giving, that is. But anyway, the author goes on to say that, quote, "In matters such as these, in the Buddhist and now the American immolations, the truth of what has happened will not be fully acquainted to men until the last day of the world, to the embarrassment and consternation, no doubt, of every single man, and also without doubt to that subtle amusement with which God practices forgiveness." The verse that the chapter begins on is, quote, "It has happened to them according to the true proverb, the dog turns back to his own vomit." 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 22. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I try real hard to learn from my mistakes. As a nation, it doesn't seem like we have a habit of doing that, but perhaps if we make a more concerted individual effort, eventually we'll have some improvement. Okay, chapter 3, the warfare between the races. Now, keep in mind that this book was written during the Civil Rights Movement, okay? And Lord, y'all, this chapter starts out with such sass, okay? So he is talking about violence here, right? And let me just give you this little excerpt. "White Gentile Protestants, as usual, have the most options since they are eligible for the American Nazi Party, the Minutemen, the Ku Klux Klan, and the John Birch Society." Y'all, I'm screaming. He just called everybody out. He says that white Protestants, as usual, have the most options to cause violence and destruction. That's hilarious. That's really funny. A strong call out. So anyway, he says that he says that and some other things to say that violence, first of all, that violence cannot be classified today as more common than it was in the past, because there's just no way to empirically prove that. And to say it is just a dramatization, honestly, and it just causes more problems. We know more things now because at the time that he was writing this, they had the news. Still not the 24-hour news cycle, but they had the news, And then now in modern day, we have social media and the internet. So we know what's going on all the time. And he does, most of the things that he says in this book are very much still true, still accurate today. But I will say that he does say this, and I would not consider this true today. He says that the facts of violence cannot be ignored, suppressed, or distorted because of the fact that we often have the ability to see the whole thing. Now, unfortunately, we all know that that is not the case. Because of the number of people with access to the information, it can easily, constantly be distorted and even suppressed. So there's that, but I digress just a smidge. Now, Stringfellow continues on to philosophize on the different types of violence, and he says that even as a pacifist, that not all violence is the same. For example, when there are differences between deliberate and tactical violence and spontaneous, sporadic violence. Riots, for example, are often not premeditated and have no end goal other than destruction. However, their association with, largely by outside influence, different movements will completely undermine the whole of a movement. And Stringfellow calls this the violence of despair. We see this happening today. We saw it in the 60s in the United States. We've seen it all around the world in so many different incarnations. But then on the other side, he speaks to also deliberate and tactical violence, such as, just as an example, the violence that brought us to become a nation in our revolution. So I think it's really hard to damn violence the way that so many want to, while still benefiting from and also lauding the things that got us here, such as the revolution. You can't have both. You can recognize that there are different levels, there are different kinds of violence, that kind of thing. But you can't damn it as a whole while also saying, I'm proud to be an American, because you wouldn't be an American, you wouldn't have any of the things that you have right now without violence. Once again, I digress. But then, so this violence is met by obstinate apathy from the unaffected parties, the people who aren't despairing, the people who don't have anything to worry about. And that just makes all of it so much worse. Y'all, I really recommend that you read this chapter, if nothing else, of this book, because it's really good. Stringfellow ends on the note that the attitude and the judgment, the forsaking of the violence without taking the perspective into consideration, all of this is done in forsaking of the cross and of Christ and Christianity, because we are called to love undaunted by fear or betrayal or hatred or violence. And we are called to love even the one with a knife to our neck. So hating and blaming and all of these things, all of this energy that we put on people who are acting out so often, not always, I want to clarify, but so often acting out in despair of just wanting to break free of whatever is holding them back. We do that with such judgment in our hearts, and that is not the way that we have been called to live. So this verse is Romans 11:25. Lest you be wise in your own conceits, I want you to understand this mystery, brethren. A hardening has come upon part of Israel until the full number of the Gentiles come in, and so all Israel will be saved. Only when all come in. Something to think about. He's not calling for, just a few of ya. Anyway, so chapter 4, the orthodoxy of radical involvement. In this final chapter, Stringfellow writes that so many fear the involvement of the church in worldly matters, in political matters, whatever, as a sullying of the church's good name. He says that those who feel the church, however, should not take a stance on racial discrimination, on affluence among persistent poverty, on whatever social constructs separate men in their separate lives. A lot of people say, let the church be the place where man can devote their thoughts to spiritual things, away from the conflict and dissension of the world. To that, the disciple James would say this: religion that is pure and undefiled before God and the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained in the world. James 1:27. And that is to say this, that God asks us not to let the sins of the world stain our souls, but to still yet involve ourselves in the world, to care for the unwanted, to bring in the outcast, to love our enemy, and to remain free at the same time of the secular ethics of success and the idolatry of money and fame and popularity, to remain free from the social constructions of class and race, to remain free of all of these things that would stain our soul, but still being involved in the world and providing it with the godly influence that Christian involvement in and not of the world should have. We are not to be the Pharisees who claim the self-assured orthodoxy of the kingdom of God, but who, in their self-righteousness and fear of revolution, in their satisfaction with where they sat and apathy towards anybody who sat below them, they tried and condemned Christ to death. Christ himself. I mean, if that doesn't get it through to you, German Christians, they focus so heavily on the orthodoxy of theology, held so tightly to the inside of that church that they allowed themselves to become apathetic to the rise of Nazism. To be Christian and to be Christ-like, we must love the world, all of it. That is not only the people who look like you. That is not only the people who are either male or female and haven't gone from one to the other, aka transgender. That is not only the heteros. That is not only the whites. We are called to love all the world unconditionally. But we also have the public and political role of reconciliation, quote unquote, to play. Okay, so in that, we have to commit ourselves to change, to create a better world for all. In the way that Christ is reconciled in God, Reconciliation means that we must accept and love even if we do not approve. So it doesn't mean that you have to, quote unquote, agree with how somebody chooses to live their life, because that's not for you to decide. Judge not lest ye be judged, my friend. That is not your life to live. You live your own life and you worry about yourself. So even if we don't approve, you still love that person in Christ. Or just in the essence of humanity, you love that person. It means that we should be committed to equal rights, but we can still love the essence of humanity that opposes that, because that is what Christ does. He loves those even when they oppose him. And I know that that's really hard, and that kind of call to action might seem toxic in ways. I'm not saying that you have to agree with them. I'm not saying that you have to approve of how they do things. But reconciliation in God calls us to just love, to just accept the world as it is, but still be willing to fight and change it for the better, right? So Stringfellow concludes in saying that despite man's assault against other men, we are called to love, the essence of humanity. And this really ties together, I guess, what I was trying to say, but lacking the articulation. Thankfully, I had this written down. We must change the world we live in by being the example. So by loving people, even those we don't agree with, we set that example of for everybody of, I might not agree with you, but you're a human and I love you in that sense, right? Quote, his purpose in dying for all was that men, while still in life, should cease to live for themselves and should live for him who for their sake died and was raised to life. With us, therefore, worldly standards have ceased to count in our estimate of any man. Even if once they counted in our understanding of Christ, they do so now no longer. When anyone is united to Christ, there is a new world. The old order has gone, and a new order has already begun. 2 Corinthians 5, verses 15 through 17. Now, y'all, I'm sorry, because this wasn't meant to be a sermon. But I really wanted to highlight some of these main points from each of the 4 chapters of this book. And like the author, I chose this topic as an indictment of modern Christian complacency in our current America. So often I feel that Christians are quickly up in arms to preserve, quote, our way of life. Y'all, what if that's not the best way? What if there are better ways? And you're too scared to look outside of your comfort zone to see it. I mean, and even more so, why do you not care if your way of life suppresses others from living their best lives, from even having a comfort zone? Sometimes your way of life might suppress somebody else from living their life in any consequential way at all. Do you not care about that? That is... I really want y'all to think about the things I've said today and the things that I've read to you. And I want you to consider why you make the choices you make. And I want you to consider Jesus, the man who dined in the home of sinners, the man whose right-hand woman, important, was a prostitute. the man who forgave and loved the man who stabbed him in the side with a spear after nailing him to a cross. And even if you aren't religious, this still stands for you because you can consider these things anyway in the context of your own spiritual or moral guides. You can consider the ethical and moral consequences of your actions or lack thereof. All right, guys. I think that's going to be all for today. I really hope that you enjoyed this, and I really hope that this encourages you to maybe look into this book. Again, it is Dissenter in a Great Society, an Indictment of Christian Complacency in American Life by William Stringfellow. It was written in the 60s. It is really good. Says some really good stuff, and it is so incredibly relative even today. Even, what is this? 80 years later. Shit. Oh, man. All right, y'all. That's kind of scary that it's so relative today, that Christian complacency, I think, in just the general sense, has maintained itself for so long. Yikes. Okay, so anyway, guys, subscribe to the Patreon for early access and also for extra content. Also, to allow me to continue working on this incredible project with and for you guys. Give us a follow on Instagram at I've Been Thinking Pod and let us know what you thought. Go check out the new website. I've been thinking I've been thinkingpod.com. How freaking exciting. I am so thrilled. We own our own domain now, and it's just a really big move. And on that site, you will also find the blog where you can get this week's episode, more or less a transcript, but pretty much my show notes in text form. And then we also have weekly posts that go up that, talk about this is what I've been thinking about this week, blah, 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 blah. And yeah, also subscribe to us wherever you listen. And if you use Apple Podcasts, definitely give us those 5 stars. Give us a beaming review. I would be so grateful. All right, guys, I'm so grateful that you listened this week, and I hope that you really enjoyed this, and I hope it gave you some food for thought. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk at y'all next week. Bye.
Hello, you sentient ball of stardust. My name is Casey Davis. I'm a therapist, and I'm an author of the book How to Keep House While Drowning, where I talk about ways to make it a little bit easier to take care of yourself when you're overwhelmed, stressed, have mental health issues, physical health issues, or maybe you're just in a hard season of life. Maybe you're looking for a place that you can come and listen to some practical advice. This is a podcast for all of the self-help rejects. We're going to talk about skills for survival and self-kindness. And I'm going to leave the pop psychology at the door. I promise not to tell you to meditate or to journal. We're just going to give you some really insightful conversations with hopefully some practical advice. So I don't believe you need to pick yourself up by the bootstraps. I don't want you to just try harder, and I don't believe that laziness exists. So join me over on Struggle Care, where we can find compassionate solutions that help us function a little bit better.
Wake up at Holiday Inn Express to a can't-miss breakfast that's free with every stay. Count on all the hot, fresh coffee you need and an incredible breakfast buffet that has something for everyone, like eggs, cinnamon rolls, and even hot, fresh pancakes with all the toppings you crave. Next time, do yourself a favor and stay at a Holiday Inn Express with a can't-miss breakfast that's free with every stay. So, when you wake up at Holiday Inn Express, you'll wake up happy. A part of IHG Hotels and Resorts.